Welcome to the Latest.com show. I'm Igor Darish. Joining me from Canada, where they don't have to worry about a Donald Trump or Ted Cruz candidacy, it's Eric Carrier, a Latest.com staff writer and Issue Hawk contributor. From Pittsburgh, he's Latest.com senior political analyst and a military vet. And joining us from New York, he's a 24-year veteran of the U.S. State Department and the author of "We Meant Well: How I Helped Lose the battle." I always get that one wrong. Lose the battle for the hearts and minds of the
We
Iraqi
lost both.
people. We lost both. Well, yeah. Uh, yeah, it's our final show of the year, and yesterday we saw the Republicans' last show of the year as they squared off to see who hates Muslim people the most. There's been a lot of talk, including here, about whether Donald Trump's comments, radicalize Muslims against America. But it's not Trump saying that he would carpet bomb the desert until it glows. It's Ted Cruz. It's not Trump insisting that he's willing to kill thousands of children in a war. It's Ben Carson. Trump is bad, but Peter, how are any of these guys any different?
Well, they're not. I mean, that's what is really so saddening, really, about what we saw last night is that they just simply differ in their ability to be articulate versus, sort of a bully boy like Trump. But they're all saying the same things that the United States has to simply kill more people. And they differ slightly in what method we'll use to kill them. I mean, Ben Carson, I guess drawing on his background as a neurosurgeon, was talking about, one mighty blow to spare them the pain of many small blows or something like that. Ted Cruz, of course, wants to carpet bomb. Trump is happy with pretty much, whatever, pit bulls, bombs, whatever. But I mean, the theme was simply we must kill more people. And you saw a whole stage full of people, not a single one of whom ever served in the military, trying to outdo each other in terms of macho jingoism. It should have left the whole world with a very frightened feeling. And with respect to Canada, I mean, these guys are crazy. You better watch your back. Um, they may not just stop in the Middle East.
Eric, a lot of people are saying
Oh,
that
no.
Donald Trump, that rhetoric is going to radicalize just as much Muslims as, let's say, ISIS propaganda videos. How is Ted Cruz's rhetoric not going to do the same thing?
I guess it's because with Ted Cruz, he doesn't get as much media coverage as Donald Trump.
He is now,
As a
now that he's a
reporter,
fellow frontrunner.
no, that's true. He's starting to, but for the longest time, every day, like top 20 headlines, all Trump related. Trump farted. Trump ate pasta for lunch. It was just
Oh, you've
everything
been reading
Trump, and we couldn't
Latest.com.
get enough of it. But we
That
couldn't
was
get
our
enough of it.
exclusive, the fart. We broke that story.
But what's important is, yes, now the other candidates are starting to get some more exposure. But I think Trump's already kind of broken the virginity of the topic when he came out so hardly against Muslims. And so the other candidates aren't receiving as much flack for it because it's almost become accepted that this year's crop of Republicans are just batshit crazy.
Josh, people are talking about that Donald Trump is dangerous. Isn't the whole party dangerous? Isn't that idea? Even though they all came out and slammed the Muslim ban, how is everything else they pretty much agree with him on?
Well, yeah, that's the one thing that I did a debate post-mortem for the site that'll be going up later. And the thing that I found was that, basically everybody in both the undercard debate and the main stage, at least when it comes to foreign policy, which is what that debate was supposed to be about, is the same thing. It's we're going to do pretty much exactly what President Obama is doing, maybe add a no-fly zone, maybe add ground troops. And that was it. There's no distinction. Thing that was more that made it more clear that this is just a beauty contest. This is just a personality contest. It was that because I remember an old Saturday Night Live bit from 2000 where it was Al Gore and President Bush in a debate, and the joke was that they just kept agreeing with each other. Well, that's what last night was, but just at a much larger scale, and they were being dicks about it.
Yeah, a few weeks ago we were talking about how the Republicans hadn't even mentioned terrorism in the debates until the Paris attacks happened. Yesterday you had several candidates, Rick Santorum, Chris Christie, all of a sudden declare that we're already in World War III. That was a pretty damn quick turnaround. Peter, are we already in a world war against, I guess, based on last night, the Muslim world?
Only in our own minds, and only to the extent that it helps the candidates keep fear alive. Um, I want to back up one quick second to the idea that there were so many people calling Donald Trump's plan to ban Muslims, disagreeing with that, and they did. I think what left me again concerned was that no one really said this is insane. Barring people based on their religion is like about as un-American as we could possibly get. And are we not completely insane and slaves to our irrational fears? I mean, no, they said, well, if you ban all the Muslims, that's going to radicalize more people or this or that. There wasn't this sense of outrage by anyone, including
to be fair, Lindsey Graham was a bit outraged, but he's outraged about everything.
Maybe I didn't.
Well, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up, Igor, and I think that deserves a moment, because up until Paris, Lindsey Graham was the only motherfucker saying we need to go to war with Islam, and I'm not saying that he was right, or not with Islam, but with terrorists. And I think that's weird that the guy who was the biggest hawk 6 weeks ago, 2 months ago, was the one who most passionately defended the idea of, it not being about Islam in a bigger picture. He apologized to the Muslim world for Donald Trump. I hope to God they didn't hear anything else he or anyone else said after that. But still, I thought that was just an impressive moment. And Lindsey Graham, only veteran in the race.
It's true.
Fair enough. But back to World War III, and of course not. This is part of the problem, is how these things get overblown in what passes for political discourse here in the United States. During the summer, there was a poll done about what Americans were most afraid of, and I think terrorism was down around number 3 on the list. Climate change, gun shootings, the usual mass shooting stuff, whatever. And of course, now overwhelmingly, the polls show that what Americans are afraid of terrorism. We saw that played out in its absurd form just the other day when the Los Angeles City school system sent 900,000 kids home based on a silly bomb threat hoax. We're fearful, and this fear causes us to exaggerate the threats into World War III. The idea, we've all talked about this over and over. I mean, statistically, the chances of being killed by a terrorist are the same as being killed by lightning, on and on and on and on and on. It is a problem, and it is not something to just kind of laugh off, but it is not World War III, and it should not be the dominant emotion that governs a country that insists in its national song that we're the home of the brave. We're not acting that way, and we should.
Well, Eric, we have the U.S. and most of Europe already involved in Iraq and now Syria. You have dozens of Arabic and Muslim countries that are now forming a coalition of some sort. And in any case, they're involved in an armed conflict. Why isn't this a world war?
Because typically, I guess the definition of world war, at least traditionally, because Peter, traditionally the definition of world war is a war that literally is engulfing the whole world, and that would be two fronts. So when we think of World War II, it was mainly all of Europe, Asia, the ocean. This one is more or less mitigated to the Middle East. While there are terrorist attacks taking place in Paris or other locations, there's not a constant battle going somewhere else. Everything is contained.
Josh, it is all of Europe involved, basically. It is all of the Middle East involved, more or less. Doesn't that meet Eric's criteria for a world war?
But there has to be fighting on two fronts.
Yeah. Well, here's the thing. It's not a war just because it's not a world war like we think of world wars. Of the two ones the from history, because one, there's no sort of state legitimate state that we would be fighting against. There's an Islamic State, but that is it's a death cult. It's like saying that the Branch Davidians were a major religious group worthy of their conflict that they had with the government. I don't think that, and I think that because of the very goal is to start a world war, that if we go about giving them that, it's only making things worse. and I don't know what the solution is. Like, I don't know what I would have liked to have heard a Republican or Democrat say about how we can't go to war with them because it's what they want, and so this is what we're going to do. And that's why I feel like it's tragic that it was just chest thumping and saying that Obama and Hillary can't keep us safe, because we really need a legitimate opposition party, someone that has a different idea than what's being done by the administration. And that's not what we're getting. We're going to do the same thing, but we're going to be fucking harder about it, and we're going to be, we're going to call it Islamic terrorism.
Let me,
and it just,
in your point, though, you were talking about how the Republicans constantly say that they fail to keep us safe. I was reading an article the other day about the military campaigns in Iraq, and I believe ISIS has been rolled back almost 50% through the combined forces of different coalition fighting groups and bombing. So, I mean, they are pushing them back. They've lost a good portion of Iraq over the last year.
Well, pretty much the entire debate was spent on the Middle East yesterday. Is the Middle East really the only threat to our national security? And how is carpet bombing it till the desert glows, as Ted Cruz put it, going to make it less of a threat, Peter?
Well, this is why this whole thing is silly. This is the same, Josh was correctly pointing out that there's nothing, we didn't hear really anything new. They just turned the amps up to 11 last night on the same strategy. But I think it's important not to just say it's Obama's strategy. We have been pursuing this same strategy for at least 14 and a half years. You probably could back it up even further than that if you wanted to. But since 9/11, at the minimum, we've been doing the same thing. We continue to try to blow up an idea only to find it skirt out from underneath us and come up somewhere else. The solution, if we can use that term, I prefer the term resolution, something that will sort of bring the current phase to some kind of a conclusion. It is really to allow the forces that are at loose in the Middle East now to come to their natural conclusions, and that is to realign the borders, which were artificially drawn at the end of World War II anyway, to realign the borders with their modern realities, the tribal, religious, geopolitical realities of where people see the natural lines between themselves and the others out there. It's inevitable. It's going to happen. What we're doing by pouring all this money and men and bombs in is simply delaying it. And we're delaying it at tremendous cost, and we're on the sidelines inflaming a whole nother process, which is international terrorism. If you had a Sunni state, then you would have a Sunni state, and ISIS would have little reason to need to try to pull in the rest of the world into their own little cesspool there. Certainly the Kurds, certainly the Shias would be a little bit out of the game. These would not be pleasant states. These would not be places where Americans would go for spring break. And there would still be adversarial relationships. However, we know how to deal with that. We've dealt with that since, practically the Neanderthal era. People who we don't like, we find a way to get along with them, or we isolate them, or what have you. But simply saying we refuse to accept a religious state run by Sunnis because, I don't know, they all become terrorists or something, it is blocking us. It's keeping us from seeing where the path that we need to travel is. I don't think America will ever have a politician, he or she with the balls to actually talk about things like that. But unless and until we do, this war will be going on forever.
Well, okay. I mean, we talk a lot about the religious aspect of it, but there is an economic aspect of it. So if you do split Iraq into a Sunni state and a Shia state, and all the oil fields are in the south where the Shiites are you really going to put an end to the conflict, or would you just change it from a religious one to an economic one?
Well, I mean, the Shia government is trying to shortchange everybody but itself in Iraq on oil revenues anyway. They're not being particularly generous on sharing.
Well, that's already, it's already at least partially one of the reasons that this whole conflict began.
Understood. If you can reduce what's going on in the Middle East right now to an economic problem limited to oil sharing revenues, that's a problem that you can tackle. That's a problem that there's a way to resolve. That can be negotiated. That's simply a money problem. Considering how we've spent what $3 trillion on the war in Iraq, previous war in Iraq, geez, we just could have paid for it at that point. Um, Really, if that's what it comes down to, that is a solvable problem. Unleashing, trying to keep a force with such that is believed in so strongly by so many people in that part of the world capped up simply is not working. We have 14 years of test bed on this one. The beta testing is over. We know it doesn't work. You can keep plugging away at it, but like I said, it'll just go on and on forever.
Josh, your video isn't working. Moving on from Iraq to Syria, there was a lot of talk about overthrowing Assad yesterday. And the one thing that struck me was Ben Carson said no one was ever better off with dictators than without. I don't know, isn't that bullshit? Weren't most people in Iraq and Libya better off with their dictator, Eric?
Way to hand me the loaded question. Things seemed a lot more stable compared to how we view the Middle East today. I wouldn't say they were better off because the reporting of killings of innocent people weren't as frequent as the different bomb camps and stuff. So I would argue that no, we're not necessarily better off today. It's just more in the forefront. Now we see it on an everyday basis.
Josh, is stability better than a dictator, or is stability worth a dictator, or is freedom more important than anything?
Well, in 2004 and 2005 when I was there, and now to be fair, I was in near Kirkuk, which is mostly a Kurdish area, so they felt very strongly that it was a good thing that Saddam was gone. So I don't know if that feeling was consistent throughout Iraq at that time, or if it's any different, now versus then. But I do think that was one sort of area where they were almost talking like adults, because it would be nice to arm Syrian rebels like John McCain wants to do and usher in a democratic Syria. It's never going to happen, but that would be nice. So you do have to make a decision in terms of geopolitically dealing with the world, of dealing with unsavory people. I mean, our relationship with Saudi Arabia, which, by the way, I think really screams Sunni state to me, is very important, and most of the Muslim world sees them as brutal dictators. There was, I think they and ISIS are, competing to see who can do the most beheadings in a year.
They're neck and neck on that.
I like that. So I think that's the problem. There's no good option. So you have to pick the best worst option, and that's going to piss people off. And in fact, that's why I think people like Rand Paul, even though it may seem naive, want to sort of champion a cause of just pulling back and not being involved and seeing what happens. Which, again, as far as worse options go, it makes almost as much sense as trying to dump a new, hundreds of troops in there and fulfilling the Islamic State's prophecies.
But I would argue that doing nothing also led to an issue. Like in the Arab Spring, I believe that was 2012, right? Exactly. But
it was 2011 maybe.
2011,
2012. But whenever it was happening,
Gaddafi was gone when Benghazi happened, and
right.
That was part of Arab Spring.
During the Arab Spring, when all the different regimes were being toppled, the U.S. didn't really get involved that much. And that, to me, was one of the most natural opportunities for them to play a part without being too forceful, and to maybe try to push in the type of governments that they want. Because, I mean, through history, the U.S. used to just topple somebody, plant somebody, and then lets it kind of fall to crap. But that was a natural uprising. It wasn't artificial at all. And I think that was one of the biggest missed opportunities.
Peter, you were
Look, I
in
mean,
post-Saddam Iraq, and you met the people that lived under Saddam and then lived without Saddam. Certainly, there were, Shiites and Kurds and plenty of people that were happy that he was gone. But as far as the majority of people, do you think they were better off after we overthrew Saddam?
well, I didn't get to meet too many Kurds, but I was in an area where there was a mix of Sunnis and Shias. I think the majority of people want some portion of the same kinds of things. Certainly, the Iraqis that I was interacting with wanted food, they wanted clean water, they wanted medicine, they wanted schools for their children, they wanted to be able to go to the market without fear of car bombs. And that type of thing. I mean, it's a hierarchy of needs. You get that stuff done just right, and then you can start to think about whether you're allowed to write letters to the editor of the newspaper and things like that. The United States has a very long history of being very cozy with dictators, evil dictators that seem to do what we want them to do. We overthrew a democratic government in 1954 in Guatemala. We overthrew a democratic government in Iran. We've played games behind the scenes with democratic governments all over Central and South America. And we've supported dictators that have managed to crawl out of the swamps on their own. The United States garrisoned South Korea, and through that process supported a whole series of military coups and military dictators, many of whom were engaged in nefarious practices, including torture. Without putting too fine a point on it, we need to remember that the United States operates its offshore penal colony in Guantanamo, where people are thrown in for no reason for their lives. We torture people. We maintain the highest prison population in the world, many of them in solitary confinement, where there's absolutely no evidence other than it contributes to mental breakdowns and things like that. So, I mean, our hands are not clean either when we blather about democracy and stuff like that. What we didn't want in the Arab Spring, and the reason we fought back against it, particularly in Egypt, was we did not want theocratic governments to take over those countries. And we certainly didn't want theocratic governments that appeared to be radical Muslim-y kind of things. Egypt is a perfect example where a government that had the support of its people was shown out the door because of American support. Yemen, another great example. Israel, for example, while they have elections, they certainly don't act like a democracy in respect to nice country in respect to other people. They're more than happy to carpet bomb urban areas, to beat and murder protesters in the street, including kids and women and children. So, this whole idea of spreading democracy is, in the words of the poet, just absolute bullshit. Our geopolitical strategy needs another big dollop of realism, particularly regarding the Middle East. And I certainly, in the debate last night, and certainly not out of the mouth of Hillary Clinton, have heard anything close to realism. It's just more of the same fantasy talk.
Well, Eric, all that having been said, originally the U.S. wanted to push for an overthrow of Assad, and then they kind of backed off and armed one of the rebel groups that's in there that wants to overthrow Assad. And now it seems like they're just going to passively watch it and try to just go after the Islamic State. Should the U.S. actively push to support the groups that want to overthrow Assad, or should we do what Russia's basically doing and make sure he stays the hell in there?
I'm trying to think on this one because I mean both stances have logical arguments to them. I think if we look at history, it's been a disaster so far. Every time we have supported a regime, when we put the right ones in place, well, what we call right, they either collapse or devolve into something worse. But then the same argument, if we leave it to its own devices, then sometimes we have crazy other states rise up, ISIS or dictators, which then it almost seems like causes this endless cycle where we have to intervene and back off. To be honest, Igor, I can't give you an answer on how we can solve the issue of these dictators. I don't think there is one. I think they're tries to play it off like they have the magic answer to the bullet fit.
Josh, what do you think our role specifically in Syria right now should be as it refers to Assad?
With Assad, It is an awful question, and I definitely think that since Putin has declared himself Team Assad,
It really ties her
I
hands,
think
yeah.
again, yeah, we're kind of now we have to be like, all right, well, I guess he's got to be gone. And to be fair, you know, President Obama, back when they were first talking about it, and with Assad using chemical weapons, um, it was surprising that they're like, we're certain he's used chemical weapons, and no one in the world cared, to include the United States. And so I think that it sends a very strange message, especially considering that the Iraq War was precipitated on the threat of mass. Here you have um, a dictator who uses them, and somehow we're not sure he should go. Um, and I think I think part of the problem is, though, is one thing, and I never thought that I would utter these words in my life, but Rick Santorum actually sense yesterday when he was sort of talking about looking at the radical Islamist problem from a theocratic standpoint, and sort of like what their goals are. And essentially what I think that does is it scratches the surface of understanding your enemy, and that's what we need to do. We need to know that, and correct me if I'm wrong, Peter, if this wasn't your experience, but we think that by setting up a good government, that'll fix the problem. But the Iraqi culture that I experienced, they expect the authorities and the government to be corrupt, and they expect it to let them down. And there's sort of a trade-off there. Like, they're willing to bribe people as long as the stuff gets done. In fact, it's almost required. So I think that the cultural differences sort of preclude a way for people on the outside of that culture to even come up with a strategy. We need to have educated expatriates from those different countries, moderates from within the country, willing to come to some kind of coalition like the one Saudi Arabia announced that is more Muslim oriented. Because I think the reason we're at this junction right here, like Peter mentioned and we've talked about, is that since World War II, people who haven't lived there have tried to dictate how these people live, and that hasn't worked. We need something new.
Well, Peter, that's a great point. On the one hand, it obviously affects our security. On the other hand, anytime we meddle in other people's business, it always backfires on us.
So, yeah, I mean, if you want to talk about security, please tell me exactly what we've gotten out of that through our actions over the last 14 years. Because clearly the majority of American people don't think we're more secure or more safe. So that's kind of a big question right there. The underlying question, and every time I watch CNN, the hairs on the back of my head just stand up in righteous anger when I keep hearing what should we do about it? Well, why do we have to do anything about it? Who's in charge of a pissant country like Syria? Why does that matter to the United States? Or pick another one, or any of them. I mean, why is this an American issue at all? It used to be, in theory, all about oil. We have to have all the oil from the Middle East. You don't hear that much anymore, but there's still that. And that is just silliness. The oil has to go somewhere. They can't eat it. They've got to sell it somewhere, and they'll be happy to sell it to whomever wants it. The Iranians, for years, would have loved to sell us their oil. And the oil was always going to keep flowing out of the Middle East when they needed to make money. That's all they've got to buy or sell. And so it doesn't really matter who's in charge of these governments. I don't know that we can point to too many governments in the Middle East that aren't some form of dictatorship. I mean, we dress it up with a pretty word like monarchy. But this is not our issue. America has to sort of decide what truly does matter for our security. And I think the answer is a whole hell of a lot less than we pretend is our problem to solve. Climate change, we might want to do something about that. That's a global problem. Facilitating greater trade among nations, that seems like a good one. Making sure that nuclear power plants are safe so that Japanese radiation clouds don't keep flying over Seattle. That seems like something worth doing for our safety and security. Never mind clearing up the problems here at home, though obviously we're talking about foreign policy here. Who cares who's in charge of Syria vis-a-vis America's broader national security?
Well, I think to your point about the we and our, one of my favorite quotes from last night was how Donald Trump said that he wants to keep the terrorists off our internet. Eric, the guy was talking about closing off, quote, areas of the internet. Is this just an old man who doesn't quite understand how the internet works, or is this actually kind of an assault on the First Amendment?
A bit of both. You can tell he has no idea how networking is, how you can't just close off sections of the internet. Like I want to see the good in people, but when people make such uneducated comments about something that's so important to humanity, and I'm not trying to play it up as a guy who likes technology, but I mean the internet, what it provides to humanity is it's a huge service for knowledge, good. But to hear comments like that, it makes you sit there and want to bang your head in the wall, because a person like this could get elected in theory. I hope not, but in theory. And if he does, and suddenly he's walking up to people's houses with scissors and cutting off their internet, I don't know if that's how he imagines it. I don't really know how Trump will visualize cutting off the internet, but it's ridiculous. It's not possible.
Well, it wasn't the first time he said it. In fact, they asked him about the first time he said it yesterday at the debate. Josh, I imagine his policy advisors went to him and said, hey, you can't do that, but I guess they didn't. So is this an old man who doesn't quite get it, or is he really serious about this? And he kind of scoffed off at the issues of the First Amendment. That's not really something you'd expect from a presidential candidate, especially a Republican.
Well, I think he's bullshitting. I think that's what it is. I think it's just him trying to talk the toughest and not having sort of the knowledge, as like Eric said, to be able to say it effectively. Like if he, to hear him talk about, certain things that he has firsthand experience with, he does actually sometimes mention specifics. But in this case, it was just chest thumping. He made an offhanded comment, and because he can't ever go back or clarify, he had to double down. And so he said he was going to, cut off the court. And he's like, I remember one of the things he said is, I'm not just going to cut off the internet, we're going to penetrate them. And it's nonsense. It's nonsense talk from a man who has no idea how to handle a problem like ISIS, but can't stop winning. And there was a lot of stupid. What, Eric?
One of the comments he made previously too, I think it was in the last time he was talking about this, was he said that he would call up Bill Gates and figure out how
he did say that.
The internet. And if you know anything about technology, Bill Gates, creator Microsoft, whatever, he has nothing to do with the internet. He's not the inventor.
Literally nothing.
He just uses it. He's so irrelevant to that entire discussion. And it just shows, that's why I think that he does believe that it's doable, but he just has no idea how. I mean, the closest thing you can say to cutting off the internet would be what China has with the Great Firewall, but even that has holes that people easily access Facebook, even though it's technically blocked. So you can't cut it off. If people want it, they'll find it. 100%.
Peter, did you want to jump in?
Yeah, tagging along on some of this, especially about talking about the First Amendment, it's worth reviewing the number of sort of anti-constitutional statements that slithered out of last night. Donald Trump, for people who are going to, one of those people may in fact put his or her hand on a Bible and swear to defend the Constitution. Well, Donald Trump doesn't really like the First Amendment part of the Constitution, and he's willing to the extent that he understands it's possible, cut off the internet and stomp on people's free speech because he likes that. You got a debate going between Cruz and I think it was it Rubio or someone about whether the NSA can still tap 100%, or less than 100% of the communications, which is the Fourth Amendment getting flushed down the toilet. And by the way, Ted Cruz, there's concerns that he may have revealed classified information by saying
Carly
it's 100%.
too. Carly Fiorina too. Remember, because she bragged about helping fight terror by letting the NSA take her property. I didn't get that story, and
it was a little vague. But the idea is that, well, to hell with the Fourth Amendment. But I think then the most egregious part of, like, why do we care about the Constitution, was Chris Christie, who was mocking his colleagues and who were in the people on the stage who were in the Senate for just standing around talking about bills and legislature and that kind of thing, while Chris was out there, doing whatever he did as prosecutor. Well,
I think he was the prosecutor that knocked terrorists out.
Yeah.
I think that's the impression I got.
Yeah, but I mean, he basically was saying, all you guys are senators who go to Congress and talk. Well, that's sort of what legislative government involves. I mean, they don't often step out of the Capitol building, crank off a few rounds at terrorists in the area and then go back in and continue the debates. These are.
Well, all I know is I'm glad that, he's right. The Senate is nothing like a courtroom where, the Senate's just a place where people come and make arguments and the people's fates are decided there. Not like a courtroom at all.
But that's sort of what government does. It can be imperfect, but to condemn the system, as he seemed to be doing, I just was very concerned about the number of irrational, anti-constitutional statements that were being made there. Inflaming people in very much the wrong direction, convincing them their rights aren't that important, and that their legislative government is just a bunch of windbags. Yeah, there's truth in that. But for a potential president, to stand up and say that, what is going wrong with us? And for none of the so-called journalists who were moderating the events to kind of poke at any of those issues, I didn't think I could have a lower opinion of Wolf Blitzer, but in fact I do.
Yeah, it's pretty terrifying. But regardless of what they were talking about last night, which is basically just bombing the crap out of the Middle East, the two terrorist attacks that have brought this all up again, even though it was buried for a while, was the Paris attack, which was executed by native Europeans, whether they're Muslim or not. They were born there. You have the San Bernardino attack they kept referring to, which, at least one of those people was American. And mind you, no mention of, let's say, the Planned Parenthood shooter or any of the other politically motivated shooters. It's only Muslim terrorism. But terrorism, at the end of the day, is, at least in some form, a threat. So, Josh, what do we do to combat the threat of terrorism?
Oh, so you're giving me the easy one. Okay.
Fix it now.
I think if short of, actually figuring out how to use the Force and establishing a Jedi Order, I think that what we would really need to do is we need to start talking about talking about this stuff in a serious way. Like, all right, the fun and games are over. People need to talk. Like, for example, Donald Trump yesterday defended his position of killing terrorist families, like the families of accused terrorists. And no one, to include Dana Bash, Hugh Hewitt, and Wolf Blitzer, they weren't able to effectively get him to even recognize what he was saying, and the people on the stage were so afraid of looking weak, like that they had compassion for someone whose favorite song isn't like Lee Greenwood's "I'm Proud to Be an American." There's no sort of rational debate happening. So the Democrats can say basically anything, give no clear indication of what their actual plans might be, and if someone like Cruz or Trump is the nominee, is going to fail the Democrats, and there will have been no significant national discussion about this. And the one thing that I thought was telling is that for all the talk of war last night, only John Kasich, and just as a desperate way, mentioned veterans and the burden of the military, and how we could barely fight the wars we have going on, let alone starting all these new wars. And no one is willing to press these candidates to say real things about that, and instead they're content to let it be the "we're going to bomb them" show, and then let the Democrats say climate change is the worst problem, and we're left wondering which one's least likely to blow up this whole crazy experiment we call America.
Well, Peter, given that most of the recent terrorist attacks, Islamic and otherwise, have been executed by homegrown terrorists here and in Europe, isn't there a better approach that we can take than bombing a country thousands of miles away?
Absolutely. We've already clearly established that the number of Americans who are killed or injured by terrorists is tiny. It is very, very small compared to the other dangers that we face in a modern life. I mean, up until including being run over by buses. I think what we really need to do is redefine the threat as a crime that is committed among us, the same way that there are bank robberies and random shootings and drugs and rapes and whatever. It's a crime that takes place in our society, and we need to scale it into the perspective that it deserves, and to treat it as a law enforcement issue. There are bad guys out there, and bad women. There's no question about that. But rather than simply use it as an excuse to grow a multi-trillion-dollar security industry, to create a new department of Homeland Security, to overturn our lives, to throw away the Constitution, all of which we can say do not work, they haven't stopped these things, then why don't we just treat it like what it is, a criminal act that needs to be addressed by law enforcement using the same tools that they have used against other crimes of violence that affect our society. The politicians need to shut the fuck up with their. Sorry, Josh, I took your line there, I mean, they just really need to pull this back. What are we going to do about terrorism? Well, what are we going to do about armed robbery? What are we going to do about errant bus drivers? These are all problems in our society and all ways that we meet violent deaths. Jesus God, when people were flying through windshields in cars in the 1950s, we made the car manufacturers use laminated glass and install seatbelts. We put warning labels on cigarettes, and we try to keep kids from getting a hold of them. Guns are okay though. But the idea is that we take concrete steps that are proportional, that we understand the problem is not going to ever go away. Depending on how you define terrorism, it's always been it's always been a tool of warfare, particularly when weak states are attacking powerful states. It's not a matter of giving in to the terrorists. It's a matter of not giving in to our fears, and to put it in the perspective that it deserves, and to deal with it as we have dealt with violence in our society. Bombing other countries, it hasn't worked.
And you know what? Peter's absolutely right on that, because, I mean, if you think about terrorism before 9/11, it was the FBI's purview, from the 1993 World Trade Center bombing, wherein they arrested and incarcerated the blind sheikh for a while, who was thought to be the mastermind of that operation. And then, up until even what Chris Christie was bragging about, which was the, breaking up of the Fort Dix plot and the other sort of prosecutorial methods that they've used to investigate, indict, and ultimately convict terrorists. And not only that, not only is that successful in that it stops sort of the individual problem as it comes up, it sort of sends a more metaphorical message about due process and sort of the spirit of the American justice system, and how that does work even in situations like this. But since 9/11, and I don't know if they would be willing to, support any elected official who says let's make it law enforcement, even though they have the best track record with terrorism.
Well, Eric, you live in a Western country in a big city. It has a sizable
Oh,
Muslim population, but yet you don't really see terrorist attacks going on in Toronto or Canada. What are you guys doing, and can we get some of it?
Well, we don't see terrorist attacks, but there still is a lot of
It's an A team made out of Sasquatches, right? That's
No, I think
Mounties.
it's that because we're a country that's founded on immigration, like the United States, and a multicultural society. I think we've learned to just let people live their lives by letting people be who they are, and that, and that people are actually quite normal at the end of the day. That we don't have to fear that these people are crafting makeshift bombs inside their mosques, looking to take down the West at any moment. Because in reality, that's not what's happening. And as long as we continue to fear mongers, scare people into seeing Muslims as some great enemy that we have to fear, then we're going to have problems. But yeah, here in Canada, we don't do that. We just live our lives as should be lived.
That sounds nice. I wish it was warmer. Yeah, so
Hey, we have the same weather.
just speaking about numbers, the Republican Party only makes up about a quarter of all registered voters, not even to mention, non-registered. And within that party, there's various policies, and most only appeal to like a certain percentage of the Republican voters. We know this based on like boos and cheers last night. So, aren't we taking what is basically a really fringe policy, but regardless of which one you want to talk about, the Muslim ban or the carpet bombing or the crackdown or the NSA, aren't we taking a policy basically supported by maybe 10% of the country and then making it mainstream? Because all we're talking about is this Republican race for months now. Peter?
There's certainly an element of that, and the candidates certainly aren't afraid to play to that what we call a fringe group. But I suspect that the majority of Americans pull bits of truth, their version of truth, out of this. And so if you say, should we carpet bomb the Muslims everywhere? I mean, I think a lot of Americans rationally will say, no, no, that's not a good idea. But we really should fight ISIS harder. And nobody's going to say, oh my God, we should agree with Donald Trump in Middle America. We better ban all the Muslims. But yet, every time it sort of happens, there's still this little mini groundswell of saying, well, we should do something about our immigration, tighten things up or whatever. So I suspect there's more people that support these concepts, even though they're still smart enough to realize we can't build we're not going to build a physical wall across the Mexican border, or what have you. Um, that's the part that's always scary about demagogues like these guys is there's people who kind of quietly agree with them, and there's a larger group of people who just sit back passively. I mean, if you want to go back and look at Hitler, I mean, how many Germans actively supported the idea of creating death camps and trying to do that? But how many Germans were kind of mildly anti-Semitic, or how many Germans were quietly saying, well, I wouldn't do it quite that way, or I don't want to get involved, but maybe not the worst thing if we clear out some of the Jews.
To be
So
fair, with
well,
that example, Hitler did win his election. God forbid if one of these guys does.
yeah, they did burn down the Reichstag at one point, and they did a couple of other less electoral type things. But the argument is on how
just a tough
demagogues.
campaign is all that is. Tough campaign.
Yeah,
No,
I
I was
mean,
just saying there was a
you know,
number that actively
the ghost
supported
came
him.
off. Oh, I understand, but I mean, I don't know how many of those people, if they held a referendum on the Holocaust, would have voted yes or no. The point being that while there's a fringe group who literally thinks the way Donald Trump thinks, and we should literally build a wall, and we literally should ban Muslims, and we literally should assassinate their families, drone strikes on wedding parties. The idea is that there are far too many people, I think, who kind of tag along and say, it's a little extreme, but the concept is good. And that helps these folks succeed. That's how they do get into positions of authority, whether they're elected or appointed or just kind of set themselves up in that way. Don't forget,
I think we're missing a big point, though.
Hmm.
Before you move on, I think what you're missing is that there are the Republicans who are fervent and sharing every conservative meme they can on Facebook. But I think what you need to look at is sort of what the conservative media landscape is like, because you have the majority of your Republican Party in the House is, they may be a little extreme on the guns or abortion or the typical social issues, but they don't think they should shut the government down over Obamacare. They don't think that just because something isn't ideologically pure, it should be completely disregarded. That is a small group that, I called them, what did I call them? The Crazy Caucus or so, I don't know, but they have some sort of name. I don't remember what it is now. The Freedom Caucus, those guys. Yeah, the Freedom Caucus. But those guys are a small group, but they've hijacked the entire narrative of the Republican Party. And the reason that they have is because most of the conservative talk radio guys, your conservative blogs, and even to Bill O'Reilly and Sean Hannity on Fox News, which is more establishment, but still pitches to that sort of paranoid demographic that, the country needs to be taken back. And I think that's what they're seeing now, is the monster is self-aware. It is now sentient, and they cannot control it anymore. And that is why we have Trump, and that is why we have Cruz, and that's why we have, Ben Carson, who wants to, send thousands of people into the Middle East, but please don't destroy the historic grain silos. It's that alone should have disqualified it. Think what William Buckley, George, what's his name? The guy, the father, Goldwater. They would have choked Ben Carson to death with their bare hands if he was the front runner saying shit like that, because the Republican Party was supposed to be the intellectual party 40 years ago, 50 years ago. Now they look at intelligence like they're afraid of it, like it's insulting. And so when someone like Rubio or Kasich or somebody says something sort of intellectual and measured, sounds a little gay to them, so they're going to go with the guy who would date his own daughter if she wasn't his daughter and he wasn't married.
Who acts like a high school bully.
Yeah, that's a good point. We all would kill baby Trump. I think we can agree on that. But
or at least
I would not fight 100 baby Trumps. I would not fight them. 100 baby-sized Trumps.
That's a terrifying visual.
Yeah, but I think Josh's point about the right-wing media is very, very important, because this is the single element, I think, that separates today's fear-mongering demagogues from their forefathers, going all the way back to baby Hitler. Imagine someone like Hitler who had access to global media to amplify every statement that he made. Imagine his ability to radicalize others. And that's what this right-wing media is. Josh also correctly points out, I suspect Latest.com's readership skews a little left of center. Certainly, I don't think we have too many of the extreme right people. If they are, they already know this. But if you take a dip into the dark, sticky corners of the internet, Fox News looks rational and intellectual. There are some real crazy stuff out there that is really part of this process of inflammation, if you will. And there's a loop where those crazy people say the things that nobody else wants to say out loud, and then it kind of filters through the system to mid-level people like Alex Jones, who has the talk radio station. He's kind of current Rush Limbaugh for those older people, and then it ends up on Fox, where it's tidied up a little bit for a broader consumption. And I guess to
and they do those. Some people are saying, and that's how they get around reporting the bullshit, because they're reporting on the conversation.
But to go back and support my own statement earlier by agreeing with myself, I would say that is in fact allegorical to this idea that 10% of the Republican Party are completely insane right-wing nutcases. But I argued that there were people in the middle who sort of take bits and pieces out of that argument. I think the analogy is, or it may not even be an analogy, is there. I mean, you've got 10% of the conservative population who reads only the conspiracy websites and listens only to the most extreme talk radio. You've got a bigger group that listens to middle of the road nutcases like Alex Jones, and then you've got a lot of people who get the same messages cleaned up for them by Fox News. And that is an amplification tool that manages the message very effectively for each sort of subgroup within the Republican sphere, and makes it very, very effective. The last point, and then I will take a short breath, is that none of those people we saw on the stage last night is going away. One of them will probably drag Hillary through the general election, but the rest of them are just going to hang around. They're going to head think tanks or go to conservative universities, or God help us, end up as commentators on Fox or elsewhere. Their ideas are not going to go away, even when they get kicked out of the primaries.
I agree with both of you, and Josh made a really good point. You know, this is the monster that Fox News has created to the point where it's basically now gone beyond what Fox News is comfortable with. And when you look at a debate last night, I mean, those people, sure, a couple of them you would call fringe Republicans, but as a whole, they represent the mainstream Republican Party. They are the nominees or whatever. Why was the debate even on CNN if this is the Republican Party today? Shouldn't these debates be on like Breitbart or Newsmax or the Daily Caller? ABC Radio hosted by Rush Limbaugh?
Well, no, because then they would lose a little bit of credibility.
But they should.
On CNN, they can argue. No, they should be, of course, but by putting them on the left networks or whatever you call CNN, it shows that they're being asked questions from somebody who's quote-unquote unbiased in some sense, even though bias still exists. So they're just doing the safe thing by saying at least they were against the person who's supposed to be hard. Because if it was Breitbart, you know that the questions would just be coddling all the time. It would get a little crazier, but yeah, I guess that would be better for us then. Maybe they wouldn't get elected.
Well, those are the people they're trying to appeal to, right, Josh? I mean, why even bother with this?
The majority, unfortunately. At least we hope that.
Well, now, again, this is the civil war for the Republican Party that we've been talking about since Obama was elected, and it's been quietly fought. The small size, like the smaller in numbers size, seems to be winning. If you look back at the way this race was supposed to go pre-Trump, you had Reince Priebus, or as Ben Carson calls him, Reince Pubis, coming out and saying that, we're going to, the Republican Party we're going to get younger. We're going to draw in Hispanics and other minorities, and we're going to be a big tent party. And Jeb Bush came out as the presumptive front runner, talking about immigration as an act of love and being very more toned down. And that is a winning strategy for a general election. But it can't happen because the primaries are this, dogfight of ideological purity. I mean, again, just 2 years ago, Eric Cantor, the second in line for the speakership, like he was going to be the speaker this year, was primaried out for an economics professor who, says God talks to him or whatever crazy shit he said that won him. But I mean, so they have to figure out how to campaign and do that in a way that can get the larger percentage of independents and moderate Republicans who don't typically vote in your primaries and your state and midterm elections. And that's, I don't know how you do that. And actually, I do know how you do that. We saw how you do it. You make everybody fucking scared that World War III is at our feet. I mean, that's the thing that they think will bring us together. I thought it was abortion. When the Planned Parenthood stuff came out, I thought that was going to be the cause they'd try to rally around. But I think they're going back to the old standards. Terrorism and Democrats can't keep you safe. And that's why we saw the debate we saw last night.
All right. Well, most people saw the debate last night. Probably no one will watch the Saturday Democratic debate, and that's kind of the problem. But we'll get back to this in 2016 and talk about it some more. Thank you guys for joining in the first few episodes of the Latest.com show. We'll see you next year. Keep reading Latest.com.